welcome to Channel X TV. I'm delighted to be joined today by Francis, calling all the way from Africa. So welcome, Francis. How are you?
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me. Doing great, doing great. Pleasure to be on the show. And I'm indeed calling from Africa, so from Western Africa, Ivory Coast, more precisely.
So really excited to speak to you because you're the CEO of what I think must be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, pan-African e-commerce marketplaces. Huge in Nigeria, but live across, is it 8 or 9 countries in Africa? Jumia,
Yeah,
tell us about what you do.
yeah, sure. So I'm the CEO of Jumia. Jumia is the one dominant marketplace, e-commerce marketplace across Africa. So we've been operating across 9 countries. The company was founded about 15 years back in Nigeria. Yeah, we have a couple of big countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, Ivory Coast, and so on. Yeah, basically, so we're operating a marketplace at scale across Africa. So the regular e-commerce model, but heavily adapted to the local context. So that's quite an interesting challenge and exercise in adapting what e-commerce is around the world to the specificities of markets in Africa, specificities of supply and demand on our continent that are quite unique. So we've built our own business model, our own supply chain model, our own logistics, our own marketing, and so on to make sure we can scale e-commerce across the continent.
And the word I found most fascinating that you said there was local, because Africa is so different to marketplaces in the UK, Europe, the US. I think for a start, it's fair to say that a lot of Africa has been a mobile first technology, but also, as you said, supply chain, actually delivering goods. Africa's not in all parts sort of regular street names, house numbers, postcodes. So can you tell us just a bit of a flavour about the evolving e-commerce landscape in Africa and how it's grown over the last decade and a half? And basically, how do you do e-commerce in Africa?
Yeah, that's a simple question. So we're a marketplace. So just like any other marketplace on earth, we're somewhere between supply and demand, and we're trying to match them, right? But the dynamics of supply and demand in Africa are very special, and the way you connect the two is also quite challenging sometimes. So supply in Africa is always kind of an issue. We're always short of goods, short of products compared to the demand we have. So that's a big piece of the issue that we have to solve. And demand in our countries, in the markets where we operate, is quite unique because we're serving people who make revenue of $2,500-3,000 a year, which is 30 times less than in the US. So you can imagine that the way consumer spend is not the same. The shopping habits are very different, and the kind of products you need to sell, the kind of services you need to deliver, all of that is completely different from e-commerce anywhere else on earth. Even if you compare with other emerging markets like Brazil, which is a big market for Mercado Libre, the GDP per capita is 10,000. And in some of the best countries,
3 times as big as in Africa.
Where I live here in Ivory Coast is 2.5, and it's a great market for us. So a very, very different consumer behavior. So from the outside, it looks like an e-commerce platform, right? Like anywhere on earth. But in practice, we've had to massively adapt it and tailor it to our local context and to the dynamics of supply and demand in Africa. Just one example is supply chain, so the logistics in between. When we arrived, there was not the right ecosystem. I'm not going to say there was nothing, but the ecosystem was not right to serve e-commerce. And street names was the smallest of the issues. That's actually manageable. So we had to build our own delivery ecosystem. We had to grow dozens or hundreds of local entrepreneurs and 3PLs so they could serve e-commerce and build the right delivery network so we could actually push volumes. So it took many years to do that. Now we have it. We have something that's very efficient, well tailored to a local context. But it's something that you would not have to do if you start e-commerce in the UK. And then adding to that, it's a market. I often get the question of whether Africa is ready for e-commerce. That's a polite way of asking whether we're not too early or whether there's a market at all. the thing is, we're working across a continent where there's a lot of demand. Population is growing extremely fast. Well, the level of income per capita is not, unfortunately, but population is growing fast. There's a lot of demand. There's a lot of poorly supplied demand, pent-up demand, I would say. And it's the whole challenge is to be able to supply that demand. Supply with the right products, which is a big challenge because we're always short in key categories because of logistics issues to Africa, logistics issues within the countries and so on. And the logistics within the countries, so the supply distribution within countries has always been a challenge. So customers who live in the big cities, but in particular in the smaller cities, don't have a choice, don't have access to much products, don't have access to the best prices for sure. And we're actually able to solve that with e-commerce, which creates a huge opportunity for us.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think especially it's easy in the UK to forget that if you're earning that little when you're making a purchase, you do want best value, but you also want to get the right product at the right time.
Yes.
And get it delivered. But what trends would you say are shaping the industry? Where do you see the biggest problems? Have you kind of solved the logistics problem yet? Is it the connectivity problem? Is it payments? What trends are actually shaping the industry today in 2025?
I think you have a lot of challenges that are manageable, right? So the logistics challenge is manageable, and we've embedded that in our business model. The lack of addressing system is manageable. The need to do cash on delivery for most of our customers is manageable. All that is embedded in the fact in how we design our operations. The real structural challenges would be, on the one hand, the availability of supply. It's still a struggle to get enough goods, enough supply, enough products to be shipped to Africa and to be allocated to Africa by international brands, producers, Asian manufacturers, and so on. So that's the biggest. That's our main battle. And then you have the scale of demand, of course, right? Africa is a big continent, but it's more than 50 countries, and 50, which is more than 50 small markets that do not, and you can very hardly trade across markets. So you have to, it's not like the Schengen area or the EU or the US or the Chinese market, right? You don't have like one big market. You have lots of small fragmented markets. And that structurally forces us to operate at country level. So it means instead of dealing with 1 billion consumers, we're dealing with 25 million consumers in Ivory Coast, 200 million consumers in Nigeria, 50 million in Kenya, and so on. And it forces us to design the business model in a way that can be profitable with that kind of scale of demand, right? And it's a few dozen million consumers per country with relatively low purchasing power, or extremely low actually. So it's a great challenge. That's also why we have very little competition online. It's a great challenge because it forces us to design a business model that's extremely lean, extremely light, so it can turn a profit on relatively small markets, but many markets. And then, of course, in the challenges we're facing, you have what comes with emerging markets. So currency volatility, external shocks, macro events, macroeconomics in general, and it's been a little tough over the past 3 years in emerging markets. As you know, it's getting a lot softer now, a lot better, stabilizing, but the past 3 years have been quite eventful.
So something that you said a couple of times now, which is interesting, is the lack of product and the difficulty of getting supply. What type of products are the leading categories? Is it electronics? Is it fashion? Is it food and homewares? What are the products that there's real demand for in Jumia, but the supply is scarce?
So I would say that's pretty much the same categories we're selling as in the UK, in the US, or in China, right? We're selling fashion, beauty, electronics, smartphones, home and living, appliances, and so on. So the basics of e-commerce, right? Nothing crazy. We exited the groceries and food segment because the economics was not right with the delivery costs that we have in our countries. But that's the same categories, the same core categories that any other broad e-commerce platform will have in the rest of the world. The only difference is the price point, of course. When we sell shoes, it's sneakers for $6. It's not a Nike for $50. When we sell a TV, it's a white label for maximum $90. So just very different price points and different specs, but the categories are the same. And then the supply availability is the big deal, right? If you open a marketplace in the UK or in China, you can work under the assumption that you'll have supply, especially if you're in China or in the US. I mean, your supply is readily available, it's quite transparent. These markets are quite mature in terms of retail. So you'll have enough to put on your platform, and then you'll have to compete on prices and to compete on stimulating demand, so to compete on marketing to get customers on board. In our countries, it's quite different. There's a lot of demand, poorly served, but it's always a struggle to get priority on supply that's coming to the country. I mean, it's our core battle. We're getting really good at it now, thanks to scale and better processes. But the core battle is to get enough, to get the right availability, quantity, and price points in those core categories. And then customers, I will not say come by themselves, but it makes customer acquisition a million times easier, and we don't have to spend much in marketing. So the battle is more on the supply side than on the demand side in our countries.
So realistically then, brands or retailers that want to sell need to look at price point first rather than being brand or label led.
Yeah, my typical customer lives in a secondary city in Nigeria and makes $200 a month. So imagine you make $200 a month. After housing, school for the kids, food and transportation, you may have $20, $30 left for something fun, like buying shoes, buying fresh clothing, or saving for a fridge or a TV. And so if you can have shoes for $7 on the market and Jumia can offer shoes for $6, then the $1 difference is very important, because that's a large part of your disposable income. So price point, affordability is absolutely critical. Availability and affordability. Yeah. A lot more than convenience, for example. If we were operating in Dubai or in Manhattan, convenience would be, of course, a lot more important. In our markets, customers will not be willing to pay much for convenience, but availability of products and affordability will be 90% of the challenge.
And how do you see Jumia's role in driving digital retail growth on the continent? What do you see for the future?
Our role is absolutely huge, right? We are the ones driving digital retail in most of in the 9 countries where we operate. In very few countries that we have strong competitors like Egypt, but in the other 8 countries, we are the ones driving formalized online retail, no question. So that's what we're doing. That's our job, and it's very easy for us to notice that e-commerce penetration in given countries mostly depends on the quality of our execution over the past 5 or 10 years. We see countries that are still largely underpenetrated by e-commerce, like Nigeria or Kenya, or countries that are much more penetrated, like Ivory Coast. And the biggest difference has been how Jumia executed over the past 10 years. We're definitely spearheading the growth of e-commerce in the markets where we operate. It's an opportunity to be first, is that to establish the brand, to establish the logistics network, and build huge, quite significant barriers to entry. It's also a risk because, as the first mover, you end up spending a little more, and you can always be too early. I don't think we're too early, that's for sure. And it's a responsibility as well. It's a moral responsibility to the rest of the online industry in Africa. We need to make it. We need to do things really well. We need to be successful because it will have a very positive impact for the whole online startup scene in Africa.
So I want to ask Francis before I let you go. We have a lot of brands and retailers here in the UK that are used to selling on Western marketplaces. eBay and Amazon are the big 2, but there's in the UK, Debenhams, B&Q, Tesco's. There's so many marketplaces, but often they'll end up with stock which is kind of out of season, and they want to liquidate it. Should they think of putting that stock on Jumia? how can brands and retailers sell? And do they need to sort of operate in 9 different countries, or can they have one Jumia account to operate across the whole continent?
So indeed, so that kind of product, that kind of offering is usually quite relevant for our countries. Like liquidation from Europe does work because it's low prices for good quality. So we're happy to sell that. The challenge is to get the products to the market, right? We don't do imports as Jumia, so we're not an import company. So companies need to have a local representative, local importer, local distributor, local something to get the stock into the country. That's step one. When that's done, then it's fully our business. Once in the country, we do storage, we do distribution, payment. It's very easy for us to manage. But we get lots of requests from such brands. The challenge is always for them to have some foothold to be able to bring the goods into the country.
And which is the best country for them to start importing to start with? And once it's in one country, can they then sell across other countries, or do they literally need to stock in all 9 territories that you operate?
Yeah, so that's the challenge. We need stock in all 9 territories because, there's no customs union in Africa in practice. So you just don't cross the border without getting another 40% of tariffs and VAT, which makes it quite uncompetitive if you keep crossing new borders. So we need stock in each country. That's a big challenge, that's for sure. And the best countries to start with at Jumia would be countries like Kenya, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, that are very successful countries for us, with a very large demand, particularly, of course, in Nigeria. Challenging countries for retail brands, but we've been able to build a business model that actually works pretty well in that environment.
So I think to sum it up then, there's 2 major challenges. One is price point and one is importing into country. But if a brand or retailer can solve both of those, a huge opportunity if they get their price point right, that there's demand across Africa for their products.
Absolutely. We need more supply because we have too much demand. That's a good problem to solve.
It's a very different problem to in the West, where you're often competing against 3, 4, 5 other retailers with very similar product.
Absolutely. We're actually operating in one of the last markets that are actually growing in size and that are undersupplied. It doesn't happen anywhere else on earth, I believe, those days.
And I think that opportunity, lack of demand, lack of competition and growing, is a great place to stop. So Francis, I want to thank you so much for your time today. But for anyone that wants to get in touch and maybe launch in Africa, how do they get hold of you? How do they get hold of Jumia?
You go to any of Jumia's websites and you go to contact us, and that's fairly straightforward. You can also go to our investor website. People will reply.
Fantastic. Francis, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Chris. My pleasure.